Yesterday, I did my best to sell you on the idea that this whole Esther story is awesome. And I don't want to give it all away because it's going to be fun to get into all of the details of it and to leave a little bit of surprise here and there. But hopefully I made my case that this is a great story, whether you think there's a God or not, whether you're into the Bible or not, whether you even know stuff about the rest of the Bible or not, whether you're into history or not. At its most basic level, this is an amazing story of an underdog who finds himself in a very difficult, very high-stakes situation. And this underdog, Esther, has access to the people who make the big decisions and have the power, but she doesn't have a ton of power herself. She's going to have to depend on shrewdness and cleverness and even something bigger than herself if she is going to overcome all odds and defeat the evil bad guy who wants to inflict a horrible calamity on her people. It is a great plot and a great story. And I think the main character of the book of Esther, from a biblical theological perspective, is the same main character as every other book in the Bible. It's God, even though God isn't even mentioned in this one. We'll talk about the theology of all of that and why that's the case many, many times as we unpack this thing together. I think the second main character is clearly, it's Esther, it's the queen, it's the main point of view character. And then I think you've got some very important supporting characters like her cousin and ally, Mordecai, the confused, bumbling clown king, the evil, conniving villain who uses manipulation and deception to try to carry out a great evil against Esther's people. But in terms of the pecking order, if we say God is the main character and Esther is the number one human character, then I think the third most significant character in the book isn't anybody else who I just mentioned. I think it's Persia herself. She is such an interesting historical lady as well. She's the first of the great mega empires in the whole grand tradition of the world, of the West, who we get to see in a very human way, thanks to the very limited collection of stuff that we have from the Persians that they wrote about themselves, and thanks to some of the stuff that outsiders to Persia wrote down, particularly three Greek guys who essentially invented a whole new way of doing history, of telling history as a story, as a discipline, thanks to a combination of that small handful of Persian sources and that small handful of sources from outside of Persian culture. We actually get a pretty good sense of what these people were like and how their kingdom worked and what the kings were like and the intrigue and the drama that went on in the royal court and how this great big bureaucracy might be steered and manipulated by even one evil person with proximity to power in a way that without even really noticing it, this juggernaut that is Persia might crush and wipe out an entire people group without even really noticing that it did it. When we went and worked our way through the book of Matthew together, which was a massive undertaking, one of the advantages we had to understanding how the original audience thought is that it's set against the backdrop of Greco-Roman culture, Greek and Roman culture. Well, they kind of won historically. I mean, really, the Roman Empire never fell. We still kind of, in a way, live in Rome now in a legal, cultural sense. And so nobody came along and did a purge of Roman thought or Roman stories or legends or myths. They all still sort of inform who we are. Not so with Persia. That extra 500 years of history that you got to go back from Rome around the time of Jesus to Persia around the time of Esther, well, it's a pretty consequential 500 years, and a lot happened in there, and a lot was forgotten in there. So while it is a bummer that we don't know everything about this really juicy, salacious, interesting moment in history, it's just as easy, on the other hand, to be really grateful for how much we do know and how much we're able to encounter this very important, very significant ancient empire in color, in a way that we don't see with the Babylonians who came before them and dominated most of the 6th century, in a way that we don't see from the Assyrians who came before the Babylonians and dominated most of the 7th century and even 8th century, in a way that we don't see with the little kingdom states and everything surrounding Judah and Israel in the Old Testament, like the Philistines or the Moabites or the Amalekites. We get little glimpses, But other than the Bible, we don't get much color from this era at all, except for at the very end of the Old Testament once Persia comes onto the scene. And that, of course, is where we're situated when we crack open the book of Esther. But all of that said, before you and I go and take a whole bunch of time and energy to look at the biblical story of how we got to this point of Esther and the extra biblical story of how history brings us up to this point in the Persian Empire, and before we dive deep into all of that, I think we should first consider whether we even need to do that. There's a big question here. What genre is the book of Esther? Is it some kind of historical storytelling, almost like a fairy tale or a legend where it doesn't really matter when it's set? Or is it something that is solidly enough rooted in history, even though it is very much told in the style of Persian history in this era? Is it something that's rooted enough in history that it needs to be understood against the backdrop of the biblical narrative up to this point and against the backdrop of the historical narrative up to this point? If we look at the book of Esther and we decide on the front end that it could be set at any time and in any place, then I don't think we need to spend as much time on how we got here biblically, and I don't think we need to spend as much time on how we got here historically. But if we decide together that it does make sense that Esther is best read in the context of the larger Old Testament story, and in the context of the larger history of the world and of Persia, then we're going to need to take a little bit of time to get up to speed on how we got here biblically, and we're probably going to need to take a lot more time to get up to speed on what Persia is and how we got here historically. But I don't want to jump the gun, so let's game that out a little bit more tomorrow, and then we'll go from there. We got time, after all, and the joy of a series like this is that we can unwrap the present slowly together and really savor it. I'm having fun. We'll catch you tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast exists because many of you kick in to make it happen, even though you don't have to. Learn more at thetmbh.com/support.